Hello, I'm Robert Bateman, and this is the Privacy Corner, where I talk you through my top 3 picks for privacy development every week. And thank you, as always, to our good friends at Privado AI for sponsoring the show. So this week, the ChatGPT task force of the EDPB has reported its first report, and it won't make easy reading for OpenAI if you look between the lines. The UK's GDPR reforms are officially dead. Should we be celebrating or commiserating? I will take a look at what could have been. The Irish DPC has released an excruciatingly long 2023 report, so I've picked out some of the interesting bits for you. So the EDPB versus OpenAI. This is the first report on the ChatGPT task force that was set up last year to coordinate sort of investigations and complaints back before OpenAI had a European establishment. First off, note the EDPB does acknowledge that OpenAI now has a European establishment. The complaint from Noib recently suggested that the OSS should not be available to OpenAI because it makes all its decisions about processing in California, allegedly. This probably is a bit of a blow for that argument because the EDPB does seem to recognise ostensibly that the one-stop shop is available for OpenAI. First off, the special categories of personal data come up a lot in this report. So OpenAI scrapes the web for training data. Inevitably, it will get some information about sex life and health and race and whatnot. And it needs a condition to do that under Article 9. OpenAI says this is data that has been manifestly made public by the data subjects. The EDPB says, well, it's been made public, but to know whether it's been manifestly made public, you'd need to know the intentions of each data subject. That, of course, is not feasible. So a bit of a problem with web scraping there potentially for OpenAI. The ChatGPT also tells people, please don't put personal data into inputs here. OpenAI does not want to assume liability for or controllership for personal data people plug into the app. The EDPB says that's not enough to avoid controllership, and they also suggest that this is a way to transfer responsibility to data subjects, which it does not like. So that won't be sufficient to avoid some controllership over some data. The data accuracy problem. Now, how can a large language model comply with the principle of data accuracy? I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm not saying that that principle is absolute, but there clearly is a bit of a conflict there, and the EDPB doesn't avoid it. You know, it could be an intractable problem for many AI providers. And the outputs by ChatGPT, the board says, are likely to be taken as factually accurate by end users. I'm not sure about that. They don't go into detail as to why they assert that users are likely to take chatbot outputs as being accurate by default. They do acknowledge that OpenAI provides a disclaimer, and that seems to be a good idea in their opinion, but is not sufficient to comply with the data accuracy principle. So probably more work to do for OpenAI there. Data subject rights are also a tricky area. So the right to rectification is particularly elusive for large language models, correcting inaccurate outputs and training data and so on. OpenAI generally suggests people make right to erasure requests instead. The EDPB does not seem to think this is a long-term solution, though it does seem to show some appreciation for it as a stopgap, but lots more work to do there too. I will say OpenAI has made some substantial improvements to data protection in ChatGPT since the Italian authorities' intervention last year, but clearly still lots of work to do. Whether it can technically be done is unclear, so watch this space. Next up, the UK Prime Minister announced a general election last week, and that means the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill is dead. It could have been rushed through before the end of Parliament, but that is not happening. So have we lost a great reform that would save businesses billions of pounds, or a stripping back of human rights that would cost the UK adequacy in the EU? I won't take a position on that, but here are some of the interesting bits of the bill that are now no longer happening. So first of all, just to say, this was pretty near completion. It's at report stage of the House of Lords, so our glorious and archaic legislative process, that is quite late in the day. So there was some speculation it could have got through in time, but it seems not. First of all, we had the recognised legitimate interests. This was quite an important element of the bill. This was a kind of list of stuff that the government said you could do by default, and you did not have to do a legitimate interest assessment. Some of them quite broad, like national security, preventing crime, but would have cut down on some paperwork, in the government's words, nonetheless. Vexatious subject access requests, you would have been able to deny or charge for those, rather than manifestly unfounded, which is not a phrase in common parlance in my experience. A bit of a cosmetic change, but some underlying stuff about how to recognise vexatious requests that was actually quite well received when I was running training on this bill. Automated decision making rules, the scope would have changed quite significantly for those. Only special category data would have been within the scope of Article 22, so it could have been a lot more automated decision making happening with just regular old personal data with no need for human intervention and so on. The senior responsible individuals would have replaced data protection officers. That phrase, data protection officer, would have been stricken from the UK GDPR altogether, but senior responsible individuals who could have been appointed with no data protection knowledge or experience, they just had to be a member of senior management. They could have delegated their tasks to another person, which most likely would have been the DPO. So could have been, it was an interesting idea, this one. Not entirely malicious as far as I could see. It would, I think, have sharpened minds a bit on some boards, perhaps. The Ropers got a bit of a rebrand to personal records of, I can't remember the new name, but they also offered a bit more flexibility. You basically could have decided what to put in your ROPA based on your resources, the nature, scope, context, and so on. And that was also quite well received by some bureaucracy-heavy organisations I spoke to. The Information Commissioner's Office would have been completely rejigged and become the Information Commission. This was quite a controversial part of the bill that the ICO was already preparing for and trumpeting, but it would have possibly involved a bit more government interference in the ICO's activities, and was probably the biggest threat to adequacy in the bill. And losing adequacy for the UK is definitely something that the government should want to avoid. So someone else might pick up data protection reforms at some point. The government's likely to lose the election according to the polls. The opposition hasn't really said much about this stuff. I think that we can pretty much forget about all this stuff I've spent so many hours reading and explaining over the last couple of years. The Data Protection Commission in Ireland has published a 148-page annual report. They are not good with brevity at the DPC. All Helen Dixon's decisions were of similar lengths to this. Very, very, very long documents. But I picked out some of the most interesting bits. So first of all, they imposed over €1.5 billion of fines, and the majority of that was against one company, Meta, who got a €1.2 billion fine for failing to comply with the Schrems II decision. There's something in there about that still being ongoing. I mean, God save us if that complaint is not wrapped up yet. That really was very long-winded. The TikTok complaint. The decision also gets a nod. That was 345 million euros, one of the biggest in GDPR history, and about data protection by design, that sort of thing. They had 11,200 new cases. That's 20% more than in 2022. And they resolved quite a lot of stuff through amicable resolution. This is something they have in Ireland to basically close a complaint with no further action, that critics say is somewhat overused by the DPC, but I don't really have a view on that. They also participated in over 150 EDPB meetings. I hope some of those were short for the DPC's sake. 150 EDPB meetings, that is a lot of meetings. And they spoke at 120 speaking events. That's like one every few days. Pretty impressive public speaking arrangements there. I'm sure some people in Ireland will say that's too much time speaking, not enough time fining or whatever, but it's important to get the word out about data protection, of course. Why do you think I do these videos? Finally, there are some interesting sort of tidbits on what might come up next year. Some EDPB cases I was not aware of that are ongoing and awaiting sort of sign off at the Article 60 stage. One into Google about processing location data. They've had a lot of trouble in the US about that, and transparency. One into Yahoo, also about transparency. And one into formerly Twitter. The complaint seems to be about not deleting posts or tweets, as they used to be known, containing personal data following a right to erasure request from a user. Could be an interesting one, that, because you know, there's a content moderation, data protection, intersection type stuff can be pretty juicy. So that's all from me this week. Thank you so much for watching or listening. Thank you again to Privado AI for their support, and I'll see you next week.